Hello everyone, welcome to this lecture on free will. My name is Hans Doormalen. I work at the Department of Philosophy of Tilburg University. And let me start by warning you for a spoiler alert. I don't know whether you've seen the movie Pulp Fiction by Quentin Tarantino. It's an older movie, but it's worth watching. And in this movie, there are two assassins, and one is named Vincent Vega. And what they do is they go to an apartment, and they have to retrieve a suitcase from their boss. Some guys have stolen it. And when they arrive there, they wait a little bit before they enter the apartment. It's clear what they're going to do. They're going to retrieve the suitcase, and, well, they have guns. And, for instance, they kill a guy named Brad. After they've done that, they take the suitcase, and they also abduct Marvin. And then he accidentally shoots Marvin as well. So let me go first to Brad. So Vincent Vega kills Brad. He goes to the apartment, gets out his gun, and shoots him. Probably you agree that if this would happen in the real world, and I take a fictional example because, well, that's easier to talk about, but even in the real world, if someone would have killed someone like that, this person should be punished because he could have done something else. So they wait outside the apartment and they talk to each other and then they go in. So there is a moment of reflection, you could say, that Vincent Vega could think, well, maybe I should not kill this guy, Brad. But still he does. So we have the intuition, our common sense view, that he could have done something else, or at least he could not have killed Brad. So he needs to be punished for murdering Brad. Now, let's also go to Marvin. What they do, they abduct Marvin, and Marvin is put in the back of the car, that is on the back seat, not in the trunk, but he's in the back seat of the car, and Vincent and Jules, the other assassin, they have a debate, but Vincent has a gun in his hand, and then he asks at one moment, "What do you think, Marvin?" And then he accidentally shoots Marvin. Okay, so they have killed Brad, and they've killed Marvin. Now, clearly, he should not have pointed the gun at Marvin, but it was some kind of accident. So, with respect to punishment, you could now ask the question, does Vincent Vega, who shot both Brad and Marvin, does he deserve punishment? Well, most people will say yes, and he deserves more punishment for killing Brad than for killing Marvin. Because killing Brad was premeditated murder. He did it of his own volition, of his own free will. And, well, the killing of Marvin, well, that was kind of an accident. So he was still responsible for pointing the gun at him, but it was, when the gun went off, it was an accident. So he deserves less punishment. Now, what I will argue is that this is a non-issue, because it presupposes the existence of free will. And free will is like a unicorn. I hate to break it to you, but free will, just like unicorns, do not exist. So free will doesn't exist, unicorns do not exist. I hate to break it that unicorns don't exist. It would be nice if they did, but they don't. And free will doesn't exist either. And I know, this is counterintuitive because if free will doesn't exist, then no one's responsible for anything they do. And if you're not responsible for anything you do, if no one is responsible, then no one deserves to be punished. That is highly counterintuitive. Because, and I think that's one of the main reasons why this is counterintuitive, because if I say free will doesn't exist and therefore responsibility doesn't exist and therefore no one should be punished for anything they do or praised for anything they do, then you say, well, but I do have free will. I experience free will. That is, our phenomenology, that is the way we experience things, informs us that there is free will, because I experience free will. I can move over there and I can stay over here. Well, I will move over here. Clearly, evidence for free will. Because my experience tells me I have the feeling of free will, and therefore I actually do have free will. And the question, of course, is whether that's a valid argument. And it's easy to see that it isn't. Because our phenomenology, so the way we experience things, often informs us about the world, while it's actually misinforming about the world. So if you look at this picture, then at the crossings of the white lines, you see all kinds of gray dots. So you experience gray dots. Your phenomenology tells you, well, I see gray dots. But if you actually look at a single crossing, then you'll see that there is no gray dot at all. There are no gray dots. Our experience tells us that there are gray dots, but actually they are not there. And there are many, many examples you can give of our phenomenology misinforming us about the world. This is just one of them. So what I want to say here is our phenomenology might misinform us about the existence of gray dots, so it might also misinform us about the existence of free will. You can experience gray dots, but they aren't there. You can experience free will, but it isn't there. And that means that your phenomenology of the existence of free will, or the feeling of free will, does not provide a valid argument for actually believing that it's there. Right, so this is highly counterintuitive, and I'll try to explain in the rest of this lecture that free will indeed doesn't exist, which is counterintuitive, but I hope that in the end you agree that our phenomenology, our brain, tells us that there is free will, and it actually fools us. So it's an illusion created by our own brains. Our brains are fooling us. Our brains are fooling themselves. Just like with the gray dots. Okay, so what I'll do is first I start by some conceptual clarification, because we need to know what we mean by free will, so we're not confused about that. And then I'll talk about the different positions in the debate. Of course, there is the position that there is free will and the one that says there is not, but it's more complicated than that. After that, I'll explain that all but one position should be rejected, and the one that should not be rejected is hard determinism that says that free will does not exist. Then we'll get to the conclusion and to the implications, because if free will doesn't exist, that has some huge implications for society. Right. So let's take some steps back. Let's look at what we normally mean by free will and what we do not mean by it. Then go to the debate whether it exists or not, and the different positions. And then you'll see in the end that free will indeed doesn't exist. There's no responsibility, and no one should be punished. Okay. What do we mean by free will? So let's take a moment to think about the concept of free will and some other related concepts. So let's do some conceptual clarification, so we know what we are talking about. So, one thing first. Some people say, I want something and therefore free will exists. I want an ice cream. I really want an ice cream. Now suppose for a moment that free will exists. Then wanting an ice cream is different from the free will we are talking about. So I can really want an ice cream, but I've had enough ice creams already. So from my own free will, I could think, well, maybe I should not go and buy an ice cream. But I still want it, right? So there is the difference between wanting something, wanting to do something, wanting to eat an ice cream, and actually doing it and deciding to do it or deciding not to do it. And this latter part, that is what free will is about. So I can do something, if free will exists, of my own free will. I can decide not to eat an ice cream, even though I still want the ice cream. So to want something, to desire something, is not the same thing as having free will. So it's perfectly compatible with the non-existence of free will that I want an ice cream or that I don't want an ice cream. So that's one. The second concept we need to think about is behavior. So, roughly speaking, there are two types of behavior. One are reflexes or stimulus-response behavior. So imagine you're at the doctor's, you're sitting on a table or on a chair, and he hits you with a small hammer and you kick. That's a stimulus response. There's input and there's output. And if you then kick over a vase and the vase breaks, then, well, are you responsible? Do you need to pay for the vase? Well, you couldn't help yourself. The doctor hits you with the hammer, then automatically you will kick. So you didn't decide to kick. But if you go somewhere and you use a karate kick to kick over a glass of water or someone in the face, then you say, well, you shouldn't have done that. And that's an action. So there's free will, there's intention, there's motivation behind an action. So if we now look at behavior, we have two types of behavior. That is reflexes, and there are actions. And reflexes is basically stimulus, response, input, output, one cause leads to the effect of, for instance, kicking. And in an action, you decide to do something of your own free will. You have made a decision to do that, and you could have done something else. So that means, in this conceptual clarification, that means that actions can only exist if free will exists. If actions is the behavior we display out of our own free will, well, then they can only exist if free will exists. If free will doesn't exist, there are no actions. So everything we then do is merely behavior, because every behavior is then a reflex, a stimulus response. So that's the only thing there is then. And I will argue that there is, that this is the right picture. And that means that what we usually call actions are merely complex sets of stimulus response behavior. So that's what I will argue for, that kicking someone is also stimulus response, is not an action. Actions don't exist. Okay, so what is free will then? So we have seen it's not desire. We have seen that you need free will for an action. So what is it? Free will is the ability to consciously make a choice. So I make a choice to do something. It's also the ability to make a choice, and I could have made a different choice. That is important. You could have done something else, or at least not done the thing you did. Vincent Vega shoots Brad, but he could have done something else, or at least not shoot Brad. So it's a choice to do something or not to do something. Is the ability to cause an action, so it's an action, by a decision without it being caused by something else. That also is important. I'll get to that in a moment. I'll explain all the different elements here, all the important principles behind it, both important principles. And that means that if this is what free will is, then free will is the kind of control you have over your behavior, your actions, that makes you responsible for something, because if you actually killed someone and you could have refrained from that, if you could not have killed this person, then they say, well, it was your decision. It was not an accident. It wasn't caused by anything else. You were the cause of this person's death, and that makes you responsible, and therefore you need punishment. And of course, you base your actions on things you find important. That also is an element. I will not go into that. I think that's intuitively clear already. Okay, so free will is the ability to make a conscious choice between at least then two different possible actions. And that makes you responsible. You were the one deciding what to do. Do I do this? Do I do that? And I decide what to do. Okay. That means that there are two principles that have to be true if free will exists. So we are doing conceptual clarification here. We say free will means that you make a choice between two or more different behaviors, two or more different actions. And that means that you need to have alternative possibilities, and you have to be the cause. So there are two principles here, the principle of alternative possibilities and the ultimate cause principle. Let's look at that, because those two principles are really important for the debate whether free will exists or not. So, the principle of alternative possibilities. I am in a situation where I have to make a choice. I am Vincent Vega. I have to make a decision. Do I go into this apartment and kill someone, or do I go home? That's basically the principle what's in play here. Acting of your own free will means that there are all kinds of possibilities, possible actions in the near future, and I make a decision between those possibilities and pick one and do one. So let's go a little bit into that to see that we are different, if free will exists, that we then are different than other physical objects. So if you have dominoes, for instance, there are never alternative possibilities. Once the first domino is tipped over, it will tip over the second will tip over the third, etc. And then the fifth might, if it could have a mind, and it might think, okay, I want to go up, or I want to go left, or I will not fall over. There is no alternative possibility. So they all will fall. And there's just one thing they can do. For us, in many cases, that's also true, that there is no alternative possibility. If you dive from a rock into the ocean, and then halfway through you think, maybe that wasn't such a good idea, I'll go back. That will not work. So if you do that, then there are laws of physics, and you will fall into the ocean, whether you want it, whether you like it or not. So there is no alternative possibility. You will fall into the ocean, just like a domino. The domino will tip over, will fall against the next one. You will fall into the ocean. So no strange things here. But there is something when we're talking about our actions. There's something strange going on there. We seem to be not like dominoes, at least not all the time. So suppose you're on a road and there's a sign, speed limit, 25 miles an hour, and you want to drive 65 miles an hour. Are you allowed to do so? Well, obviously not. There's this sign that says you're not allowed to do so. But that's not our question. Our question is it possible? Well, in some sense, obviously yes, because why would there be a sign if you couldn't go faster than 25 miles an hour? Apparently people drive too fast. So depending on your vehicle, of course, the answer is yes. And it seems that in cases like this, we are different from dominoes. It seems that I have a choice to speed, to go faster, to turn around, to stop, whatever. There's one possibility that I will actually do, but there is more than one possibility that I can choose from, at least sticking to the speed limit or going over the speed limit. That's two different choices I have to. That's a choice I have to make between two possibilities. So I make this choice in this from these two or more possibilities. And that takes us to the ultimate cause principle. That basically says that I am the cause and nothing else. If I decide to speed, if I decide to go over there, if I decide to kill someone. So if you act out of your own free will, then you're not like a domino. So if a domino in this total set, so if you take domino 25, then what happens? Well, it tips over. Why? Not because it decides to tip over. It says, well, I'm going to do that. No, the 24th bumped against it, and that caused it to tip over. And then it falls against the 26th, etc. So that means that the behavior of this 25th domino is caused by a prior event. Now, if I, from my own free will, decide to do something, then that is not caused by a prior event. Then I am the start of a chain of causal events. For instance, if I decide of my own free will to tip over the first domino, then that's the start of a long chain of causal events, of dominoes tipping over the next domino. But I made a choice to do that. I was not caused to do that. If someone takes my hand and slaps it against the first domino, then you can say, well, you were not responsible, it was not a choice, and it was caused, you tipping over the first domino, by a prior event. So it was the effect of something. If I make a decision to do something of my own free will, then I am the cause of that action and nothing else is. So I am the start of a causal chain. I'm not something in this causal chain. So that's the ultimate cause principle. So we have two principles if free will exists. So this is conceptual clarification. What do we mean by the notion, the concept of free will? Well, we mean that you have a choice and that you, when you make the choice, are the cause of this choice, of these different possibilities. So I think that this is the common view, the common sense view of what free will means. So we find this in philosophy, we find this in law, and we find this in everyday practice. If we say this person should not have done that. If we talk about a killer, and you say, well, he shouldn't have done that, whether you're talking in philosophy, you're talking in law, or at the dinner table, you say, well, he should have done something else. He shouldn't have killed Brad. So that's what we usually mean by free will. And I will argue that doesn't exist. So those principles are false. They are not true. Okay. Why do I say that? Well, in order to evaluate a claim like that, we need to know what the different positions in the free will debate are. And the main views we need to understand are hard determinism, libertarianism, and compatibilism. There you see already that there are three different views. Well, you might think there are just two. Free will exists or it doesn't. So, of course, that is the case. Of course, there are two main views. So let's call them Team A and B. Team A says there is no free will. And Team B says there is free will. And of course you can say, I don't know, I find this too difficult. I'm agnostic about it. But then still, you will say, well, either it exists or it doesn't. So free will exists or it doesn't. So we're not talking about the latter position, that you're an agnostic. You say, I don't know. I'm not thinking about that. It's too difficult. Okay. So we're talking about people defending either the claim that it doesn't exist or the claim that it does exist. And then there are not two, but three views. So there's team A, and that's basically the view that says there is no free will, that's hard determinism. And that's the only view that says that. And then there are two teams that says that free will exists. That is libertarianism and compatibilism. Why are there three teams? Because hard determinism from team A and libertarianism from team B argue that it can't be the case that free will exists and determinism is true. And that view is called incompatibilism. So the existence of free will and the truth of determinism can't go together. And obviously then there is the alternative to that, and that is compatibilism. So I need to explain what this all means, but this is basically our overview. There are three views: hard determinism, libertarianism, and compatibilism. But you see that within this debate, some people from team A and some people from team B are in agreement about something. Okay, so three views. Let's start with the first, hard determinism, and in order to see what that is, we need, again, some conceptual clarification, and then we also see quite easily what libertarianism and compatibilism entail. So first let's look at determinism. So not hard determinism, but just determinism. So in general. So this has nothing to do with the free will debate at all. And that is the claim that at any moment in time, there's just one physically possible future. So take an example of the dominoes. If you tip over the first one, then you know what, if that's time is 0, and at time is 1, you know what happens. Then the second one will tip over, and at time is, 24, the 24th will tip over, or something like that. You know what happens. There's exactly one physically possible future, which time you choose to look at. And that's a claim from science. So we're not talking about free will for the moment. We're just talking about things happening in the universe. So based on all we know, the universe seems to be deterministic. We have done a lot of research into the world in physics, in chemistry, in sociology, psychology. And it seems that the universe is deterministic. That is, there is just one physically possible future at each moment in time. So this is not just a claim about free will, it's a claim about everything, or almost everything. I'll get back to that in a moment. And it's a scientific discovery. So it's not something someone thought, well, maybe the world is deterministic. No, we have all this evidence of events happening in the world. And then you say, well, if you take all these events, then we have all the reason to believe that the entire universe is deterministic in nature. So it's a claim from science. Famous example to elaborate a little bit on what this means is Laplace's demon. Laplace says, well, imagine an all-knowing demon, so God, something like that. If this all-knowing demon knows all the laws of physics and knows where everything in the universe is, where all the particles are, where all the planets are, where all the billiard balls are, and at any given moment in time, any time you pick in the entire existence of the universe, this demon, because this demon is all-knowing, knows for all the particles in the entire universe, what will happen next. So if you look at this, well, we might be able to predict what happens next. But even so, we might be wrong if it goes even for something as simple as billiard balls, as pool balls. But the daemon is all-knowing, so for this daemon, well, the past, the present, and the future are known in the very same way, because you can always go back in time and say, well, if I pick something, a time in the past, you can also predict, you can also know, if you're a Laplace's daemon, where it will all end up. So that's determinism in general. Now, if you explain this, say this, then there's always someone who says, well, wait a minute, at the subatomic level, there is randomness involved. At the subatomic level, the world doesn't seem to be deterministic, if you look at quantum physics. That's something I'll return to in a moment as well. So above the subatomic level, the world is deterministic, and that's where my behavior is. So that's where your behavior is, whether it's a reflex or an action, if they exist. Now, incompatibilism, now we're talking about free will, the debate of free will, the free will debate. Incompatibilism says it can't be the case that free will exists in a world that is deterministic. So then there are two options, obviously. If we have the claim that determinism is true and the claim that free will exists, and they can't go together, then there are two options. So either free will does not exist, and then determinism is right, or, well, free will does exist, and determinism is wrong. That's what the libertarianist would say. And of course, a compatibilist would make the other claim. The compatibilist would say, no. Could be the case that there is free will, that free will actually exists, and that the world still is deterministic. So then you can look at the three different views. So hard determinism. That says free will does not exist. Why do they say that? Well, they accept this claim from science that the world is deterministic in nature. If the world is deterministic in nature, and they also accept incompatibilism, well, then it automatically follows that free will doesn't exist, because incompatibilism says determinism can't be true and while free will exists. So that means that if you accept determinism and incompatibilism, then you say free will doesn't exist. If you say that, then it also implies that there is only behavior, there is no action, and no one is responsible for anything they do. So that's hard determinism. That's the first position in the debate. Okay, the second is libertarianism. So there's liberty in the word, so they accept that there is free will. That's their starting point, that's their first premise, that's their first assumption. Free will exists, and of course the argument is, well, I want to raise my hand. Lo and behold, I did. I want to do it again. Here I go again. So I can decide of my own free will to raise my hand. And every time I want to do this, of my own free will, want to do this, I actually do it. Okay, so that's the famous argument by John Searle. So if you ever go and see Searle, he's very funny, he's a very good speaker. Go and watch him and watch the audience, because you know that he will do this. And everyone in the audience takes a picture of Searle raising his hand out of his own free will. That's the first assumption of libertarianism. Free will exists. Libertarianist also accepts incompatibilism. So the idea that in a deterministic world there can't be any free will. Okay, now it follows that determinism has to be incorrect. And that means, well, that people are responsible for their actions because free will exists. Okay, now we go to the last view in the debate, compatibilism. And that view, of course, says it is compatible that determinism is true and that free will exists. So basically those two are the assumptions. Determinism is true, free will does exist. And based on two, the acceptance of the existence of free will, people are responsible for their actions. Okay, so this is basically the debate. And this last one, well, this one has it all, right? It's having your ice cream and eating it too. Because you take science seriously, because determinism is a discovery of science. You want to take science seriously. You don't want to say, my view is unscientific. No, you want to have a scientific worldview. So you take science seriously, you take determinism to be true, but also I have this phenomenology, the way I feel tells me that there is free will. So it also takes my phenomenology seriously, that I say, well, I have this urge to raise my hand, I want to do this, I have the free will to do this, and I do it. Okay, so this is something most people would like to have. But, well, if we look at the positions that should be rejected, this is the first one to go, for an obvious reason. And then incompatibilism, the libertarian version of incompatibilism also has to go, which means that only hard determinism can be true. So I'm going to make it a little bit more complicated. More complicated, yes. Because I not only argue that compatibilism and libertarianism have to go, but also this idea that the world at the subatomic level is not deterministic, and that is a way to save free will. So we have to take a look at that as well. Okay, so why does compatibilism have to go? Well, the argument is quite simple, but not very nice, because we want to have free will, and we want to take science seriously, so we want to have a deterministic world and free will so that people are responsible. Because if free will doesn't exist, responsibility goes out of the window, and then law goes out of the window. We have to change the way we deal with criminals. But compatibilism is false for a very obvious reason. It contains a contradiction. We never should accept contradictions in any theory we have. So if you say, I accept determinism, and that's compatible with the existence of free will, then you say, determinism tells me that there is at any given time just one physically possible future. Okay, so I think that that is true, that this claim is true if I'm a compatibilist. And I also believe that free will exists. And that means that, at least in some situations where humans are involved, there are alternative possibilities. I can shoot Brad or not shoot Brad. There are at least two alternative possibilities at that moment in time. So at that moment in time, according to compatibilism, there is just one physically possible future, and there are at least two physically possible futures. Well, that's a contradiction. And we can never accept a contradiction, and thus we have to give up on compatibilism. And people don't want to do that because it takes science seriously and our phenomenology seriously. It's the best of both worlds. So what do they do? What do they do? They say, well, it is possible to have free will in a world that is deterministic. And they don't challenge anything about the determinism part. They're doing something with the compatibilism part. That is, they try to make determinism compatible with a notion of free will that actually is compatible with a deterministic worldview. And what they do is they redefine free will. So they say, well, wait a minute. With free will, I mean this. And they reformulate it, redefine it in such a way that it is compatible with determinism, thus with just one physically possible future, and thus they give up on the principles of alternative possibilities and the ultimate cause. They remove those principles from the concept of free will. But that is, in the core, what free will is. So they change it. They change the debate from free will to, say, free will star, whatever that may be. So they're changing the topic. So they might say, if I act of my own free will, star, a new interpretation of what we mean by free will, then I'm not restricted by change or I'm not in jail. Because if I'm in jail, I cannot act freely. No, true, sure. But that is compatible with determinism. It could be that there was the Big Bang and then we're at this moment in time and someone, even though he should belong in prison, isn't in prison. Someone like real-life Vincent Vega. Okay, this person is free to move about in the world, but everything he does could be determined by the laws of physics. It's not that whatever he does is not caused by anything. And that makes it indeed compatible with determinism, but that's not the notion of free will we are usually talking about. So they're changing the debate. And you're free to do that, but you're talking about something else. Okay, so, and we're not talking about the common notion of free will anymore. So if we do talk about the common notion of free will, compatibilism has to go. Now then we look at libertarianism. Why does that have to go? Well, it's clear they are committed to the classical common sense notion of free will. So to those two principles, they accept those, and they reject determinism. But the rejection of determinism is what you could call an exotic belief, because it goes against science. Everything we have discovered in science points at that the world is deterministic. Everything we know is pointing in that direction. We have a lot of evidence for that. And we have no evidence for the idea that there is something like free will, with the exception of our phenomenology. But that, of course, is what we saw in the beginning of this lecture, not a good argument to believe that anything exists. So let's look at this ultimate cause principle, because that's where the problem resides. Have we ever encountered anything in a universe, so in the universe, that required an ultimate cause to explain? So that we say, well, here we have an event in the world, it's happened, but we have no idea what the previous cause was, and therefore we have reason to believe that there was an ultimate cause causing this from out of nowhere. Because that's basically what the ultimate cause principle says. There was no previous cause causing this to happen. So if I decide to do something out of my own free will, I am the ultimate cause, and there was no cause causing me to decide something. The decision came out of nowhere. And we have no reason to believe that that ever happened. If you look at, well, textbooks in science, If you're a student, you have textbooks in science. So you can study biology, for instance. And does it say there in those books somewhere, and then there is an ultimate cause causing you to live or something like that. Maybe in previous, well, centuries ago, we might have some life force, some mysterious life force, but then still it might have come from somewhere, and it might cause it might be caused by some other events. But there is no such thing in contemporary biology. We can explain everything. We can explain life. We can explain the evolution of all the species without any ultimate cause. In psychology or in neurology, you also do not need such notions. You don't need something, again, we had it centuries ago, or maybe some people still believe it, but there's no empirical evidence for it. Something like a soul. There is no such thing as a psychology book that says, and here you need a soul to do this. And your soul is capable of generating events to cause something without being caused itself. The same goes for neurology. There's no neurology book that says, well, and here we have the transition of neurotransmitters, but in between there is an ultimate cause. There's something coming from outside causing stuff in the brain. Now, that doesn't happen. And so neuroscience is the obvious place to look for additional arguments, because this is basically a very brief summary of the scientific evidence that points in the direction that determinism is true. We can explain all these things without an ultimate cause. So no need for an ultimate cause, and no need for an ultimate cause in our behavior, because psychology is about predicting behavior, for instance, prediction and control of behavior, as John Watson, the famous behaviorist, said. That's what psychology is about. You can do that without postulating ultimate causes. People are actually predictably irrational, for instance. So that's contemporary psychology by Dan Ariely, for instance. If you look at that, so look it up, and then you'll see that psychologists are very good in predicting your behavior, even when it's irrational. No ultimate cause needed there. It's just brain mechanisms, psychological mechanisms we all have. And those are caused by something and cause our behavior. But let's take a brief look at a famous example in neuroscience that supports, in the end, the claim that free will does not exist. But the feeling of free will does. And that's just brain activity. The feeling of free will is just an activity of the brain. Okay, so basically this argument, I present you very, very briefly, and a lot can be said about that particular experiment, but I'll just want to show you what it's all about and what the conclusion is. We look at that to see that, indeed, this provides us with a good reason not to believe in free will. Okay, so the first experiments were done by Benjamin Libet, and now they have been repeated by someone like Patrick Haggard, for instance. Basically, he gets the same results as Libet got some decades ago, and all kinds of problems that were raised with Libet's experiments. He has looked at that and fixed those problems, and then still he gets the same results. What you need to do in this experiment is look at a fast-moving clock, and then you have to press a button. But when do you press the button? Well, when you want to, when you have this urge to do so, when you have the free will coming up and saying, well, now I want to press this button out of my own free will. And then the question is, so you do that, and then the question is, when did you experience this free will to do this? When did you have the urge to press the button? And so you're looking at this clock, and you can say, well, the clock was at 25. And you type in 25, you do this over and over and over again, and then a pattern emerges, because Libet made also an EEG. So he looked at the brain activity, and what did he find? What did he find? So, the brain started to prepare for the action, so it's called the readiness potential, prior to pressing the button. And that's 500, 550 milliseconds prior to the actual action. So you have this action, you press the button, 500 to 550 milliseconds prior to that, the brain builds up activity in the motor cortex. And that's, I think, common sense. If I want to press a button, there has to come a signal from my brain, and this signal has to be prepared prior to me pressing the button, and not after pressing the button. Then you don't say that that's the cause and the effect. Okay, so that is something that other scientists already had found, and he was now asking, okay, when did you experience wanting to have the free will, the urge to press the button, and then actually doing so, of course? And you might expect that that'll be at the onset of the readiness potential, so at the start, so at 500, 550 milliseconds prior to the actual pressing of the button. Or even before that, first you want to press the button, then the brain builds up activity, and then you press the button, or the mind and the brain, depending on how you think about that, what your intuition is, the mind and the brain are the same, and therefore you have the experience of wanting, of your own free will, to press the button from the start of the readiness potential, that is 550 milliseconds prior to the pressing of the button. But he did find that it was just 200 milliseconds prior to the action. So if you paint a picture, you get the onset of the readiness potential, so the start of the building up of electricity in the motor cortex at 500, 550 milliseconds prior to the actual pressing of the button. So your brain builds up electricity in the motor cortex. Then you experience the conscious will, your free will. I want to do this of my own free will, yes. And then you press the button. So your free will comes after the brain already prepares for this action. So the brain prepares for an action. So the subjects in this experiment are asked, this is about free will, and you experiencing free will, and you're pressing a button out of your own free will. So the brain prepares an action prior to our awareness, prior to we being aware that we want of our own free will, press the button. Well, yeah, that's your experience. So the brain does all that already. Now, well, let's go one back. So the brain prepares already for that action. And then Libet says, well, what happens to the free will? Libet argues, well, in between the 200 milliseconds and just before the actual pressing of the button, there is the ability of our minds, our conscious minds, to exercise our free will, because you can say, I'm not going to do this. So it's basically not free will, but free won't. So your brain builds up for the action to press the button, and then you can decide not to do this. And indeed, if you do experiments, people can do that. So you can say, well, I had the urge at 25, but I didn't do it. And then you'll see that the readiness potential is being built up, but there is no release, there is no signal going to the hand to press the button. But Haggard found that that has a readiness potential of its own, and there is no reason to believe that it's an ultimate cause. There is something that we can't explain just looking at what happens in the brain. So This is one reason, this experiment and the additional improvements of these experiments by Haggard and others, Hakon Law also has done that. They find all these results that are in line with Libet's original results, and they interpret this in a way that says, well, your brain prepares for the action, then you do it, and along the way, well, you have this experience that you can push the button, that you want to push the button, that you have the free will to do this. But actually, that's just a brain state that comes after your brain has decided for you. And this is also, of course, a reason to believe that we are our brains. Okay, so that is why, in the end, does libertarianism has to go. We have all these empirical data supporting that everything that happens in the world is determined. That science has discovered that the world is deterministic in nature, and if you then, as a libertarianist, say, well, I don't buy that, why not? Well, because I have the feeling of free will, and you say, well, yeah, then you go against science. If you do that, well, you dismiss our best method to finding out what happens in the world. So therefore, that has to go. Now, the last position that has to go is indeterminism as the savior of free will. Because people really want to have free will. So when you say the world is deterministic in nature, people often argue, well, but that's above the subatomic level, that if you look at the really, really tiny parts of the world, then the world is indeterministic. There's randomness involved. We can't predict where particles are and what they do. So the world isn't determined. And then they try to use that to save free will from the clause of determinism. And is that a viable option? And the answer is no. And interestingly, I think, it is Dan Dennett who argues that it isn't. That it isn't an option to save free will. And why is it interesting? Well, because Dennett is a libertarianist. He believes in free will. So if this would work, he would be really happy. He argues, well, people think that indeterminism at the quantum level can save free will, because then you can say the world is not determined. In order to see why this argument doesn't work, we need to look at what indeterminism is. We'll be very brief about that, and then how it allegedly saves free will, and why it doesn't work. And to see why it doesn't work, a very brief explanation of indeterminism is enough. So we don't have to go into difficult ideas of quantum physics. We encounter indeterminism in quantum physics, so we are not able, for instance, under certain circumstances, not able to tell where a certain particle is. We can only give a probability. There seems to be randomness involved. So there are processes like atomic decay that we can say, well, I don't know when this particle goes from being radioactive to not being radioactive anymore. We don't know that. There is some kind of randomness involved. And then, of course, there are two options. The world is like that, and the world actually is random at that level, that really randomness exists, or it's just us. We are unable to make predictions at that level. But the world isn't random at all. That was, most physicists will go for one. So let's do that. There's randomness involved at this subatomic level. Now, how is that supposed to save free will? I think it's intuitively quite clear that if you say, okay, if you look at free will and you take it in this common sense notion, then it is not compatible with determinism. So then if you can show that the world actually isn't determined, then you're home free. Then you have done what you needed to do. Then you have shown, well, the world isn't determined, and therefore free will can exist. That's what they say. If the world is not deterministic, then we can fit in free will at the subatomic level, for instance. So it is at the subatomic level that the free will causes us to press the button or something like that. Now, why doesn't this work? Well, let's look at Searle's argument again. Searle says, I'm going to show you that free will exists. I want to raise my hand out of my own free will. Ha! Now we do it again, on the other hand. See, free will exists. Okay, not a very good argument, but that's the way he argues. And it's not about that argument, but about what free will means compared to randomness. Because if I want to raise my hand, suppose I believe in the existence of free will, if I want to raise my hand, then it's not random. Then I decide to do that. It's not that I say, I want to raise my hand. Now let's see which random process, whether it actually happens or not. No, if free will exists and I am the author of my actions, if I cause my actions, then every time I want to raise my hand, I'll do it. It's not random, it happens. All the time. So that's also why Dennett says, this doesn't work. So basically there are two ways to argue against determinism. But they don't amount to... So you can argue from the existence of free will. If you could show that free will actually exists, then determinism is false. And you can start with quantum physics and say, well, at least at the quantum level, the world might not be determined, but they are not the same. So if you show that the world is indeterministic at the quantum level, you have said nothing about the existence of free will. So this means that it still has to go. This doesn't work. So it doesn't say free will. So basically what we have now is we have all the evidence in the world that points in the direction of a deterministic worldview, at least at the level at which we behave. And nothing in favor of the existence of free will. We have this clear contradiction in compatibilism, and you see that compatibilists, when they try to defend their view, change the notion of free will. So basically our conclusion now is, well, we have no reason to believe that free will exists and all the reason that it doesn't. So yeah, well, it works like that in science. You're never sure about anything, but you have evidence in favor of some hypothesis, some claim. In this case, the hypothesis is counterintuitive. It's an illusion that free will exists. So if we take this normal notion of free will, in which those two principles are involved, the principle of alternative possibilities and the ultimate cause principle, if that's the notion of free will, then that does not exist. Free will doesn't exist. That's what the evidence tells us. So we have good reasons to believe that free will doesn't exist. And so if you look at the experiment by Libet, you see that, well, your brain prepares for some behavior, the pressing of a button, and this is a type of behavior in which we experience free will. I do this of my own free will. That also is a brain state or an event in the brain. So our brain creates this illusion of free will, just like it creates the illusion of the great dots in this visual illusion we saw earlier. It's just an illusion of the brain. So we have this very strong experience of free will, but that doesn't validate the argument that the conclusion that we actually have free will. So, and that's why this is really counterintuitive, right? So you have this very strong feeling of free will, and then science says there's no such thing. Well, just like with unicorns, too bad. That's just the way the world is. Now, the fact that unicorns don't exist doesn't have many implications, but the fact that free will does have implications. So let's take a moment to we'll just mention some of them, and you can think about that, what it implies if free will indeed doesn't exist. So what I said earlier is, okay, we have behavior. You can make a distinction between reflexes and actions. Actions require free will, and for actions you are responsible. Now, free will doesn't exist. That means that actions don't exist. There's just behavior. Everything is a reflex, complex reflex maybe, but everything we do is stimulus-response behavior. And that means that there are no actions, and that therefore responsibility doesn't exist. And here again, you might have the feeling to be responsible for something, but you aren't. And that's really counterintuitive, right? So what that means, well, it means that, so if it doesn't exist, okay, so what else? But this has further implications, because if you are at the doctor's and they hit you with a hammer and you kick over a vase, and then the doctor says, you have to pay for that. And you say, well, you shouldn't have put a vase there. It's not my responsibility. I wasn't doing anything. It was merely a reflex. I'm sorry, but I couldn't help myself. I'm not responsible for that. So that is what, and we also have people that we say, well, they are crazy. So people that do stuff and they say, well, at that moment they did that, they were out of their minds or something like that. Then you say, well, we might lock them up in a psychiatric hospital, but not in a jail. We don't punish them. I think we agreed on that if you do something you were not responsible for, so if you merely displayed behavior and it had bad effect, then we say, well, this person should not be punished. But if what I'm saying is true, then also murderers, like Vincent Vega, or then of course in real life, should not be punished, because even though he was standing in front of the door talking to his mate and saying, well, we're going in and we're going to kill this guy, let's do this, you say, well, he could have done something else. No, he couldn't. Because ever since the Big Bang, it was all determined that he would do that the killer would kill this person. And that means that we shouldn't lock up individuals just to punish them, because they couldn't help themselves. Just like someone who is mentally incapacitated, who has not the mental capacities to make proper decisions. You say, well, yeah, this person should be locked up, but in a hospital, not in jail, because he doesn't deserve punishment, he deserves help. Basically, what this means is that any killer has a really strange brain and there's something wrong. We shouldn't punish them, but they should be locked up, right? So we might not have to make too much of adjustments to our criminal system. What we should do is not punish anyone, but put people in jail and give them treatment. Try to change their brains. But that goes, of course, against our intuition, because we have this really strong feeling of free will, and therefore the idea that free will exists, and therefore that people are responsible. So will we do this? Will we actually change the system, how we treat people that kill someone, and that for the moment, at this moment, we put in jail because you say, well, they go to an institute, they get checked out, and they say, well, they're not crazy, there's nothing wrong with them, so they can't stand trial, and then we punish them. Are we going to change that? Because I think we should. And that, of course, is something that's also determined ever since the Big Bang. Whether we actually will change our society in such a way that we all say, yeah, indeed, free will is an illusion created by the brain, and therefore actions don't exist, and therefore no one is responsible, but still we have an individual here who has killed someone. We don't want them in our society, and we put them not in jail, but in a mental hospital. And we let them go only when we're sure that he will not kill again. But it also might change. So in the Netherlands at this moment, people can refuse to be to go to a hospital to get a mental check whether they are indeed insane, because if you are put in jail, you get 20 years and then you're out. But if you go to a mental hospital, it might take more than 20 years. You might not get out at all. So you don't want to have research done to you if you think, well, they're going to find I'm crazy and they're going to lock me up for my entire life. What we should do is lock them up anyway, give them treatment and let them go only when we are sure that they will not, perform their bad behavior, display their bad behavior again. But this is wait and see. Just waiting and see how the Big Bang pans out on this one. Okay. Thank you for your attention. If you have questions, here's my email address, and I'll try to answer them as quickly as possible.